Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Monday morning. Thanks for being here. A few reminders for those of you on Zoom. Please remember to keep yourself muted during the presentation so we are not picking up your background noise. Second, please submit your questions and comments into the chat, and I will share those with our presenter when it's time. Also, for the most optimal experience for those of you at home, you might want to click on your view button in the upper right-hand corner and select speaker view so that the primary part of your screen is the speaker and the slides. I think that's it. I'm going to turn it over to Larry Lynn, who will introduce our speaker this morning.
Now we are.
Okay. Okay, it looks like we're ready. Good morning and welcome to Great Decisions, the future of Persian Gulf security. Our speaker this morning, Paul Heusenfeld, was born to missionary parents and grew up in the Middle East speaking Arabic as his first language. During his middle and high school years, he attended a missionary boarding school in India. He attended Hope College, and after graduating in 1972, was commissioned in the US Navy as a flight officer. Paul had assignments in London, England, Rota, Spain, and in the Bahrain in Middle East. In 1983, he attended graduate school at the University of Arizona. Then in 1984, Paul joined the US Department of State, where his career led to 6 assignments in Washington, D.C., and 9 embassies overseas. They include Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Syria, Tel Aviv, Israel, Bahrain, Rome, and Brussels. Currently, Paul is a visiting fellow at Hope College's Van Raalte Institute. His interests include art and drawing visual puzzles. He has published 3 books, and inventing is one of his hobbies. He has been a regular lecturer at HASP, has served on our curriculum committee, and has been a board member at large. Please join me in welcoming fellow HASP member, Paul Heusenfeld.
Good morning. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I've done quite a few lectures for HASP, but this is the first time I've been in this room. What a great facility we have here. So this is really, really a nice new venue to do this. Thank you for the introduction, Larry. One thing I will say that Larry said I had 6 tours in Washington, D.C. And I would like to add that that was 5 tours too many in my mind. Today, we're going to talk about Persian Gulf security. And I'd like to begin by saying I have trouble with the title right off the bat, because I've been on the Arab side of the whole situation in the Gulf, and they call it the Arabian Gulf. For one thing, the Arabic doesn't have the letter P in it. So you can't say Persian Gulf in Arabic. I face this myself because my name is Paul, begins with a P. And so I was often called Baal, or the Arabic word in the Bible for the Apostle Paul is Boulos, which, so they were familiar with that. So I was often called Boulos. But anyway, I'm used to calling the Persian Gulf the Arabian Gulf. I'll try to keep it to the Persian Gulf today. Persia doesn't exist anymore. It's now Iran. So this is a relic from the past that we continue with to call it the Persian Gulf. And in the Arab world, if you call it the Persian Gulf, they're not real happy with that. It's sort of an insult to them. So anyway, well, we've just gotten past the title here. All right. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit, give you some introduction to the topic before we get into the video, some personal information, and also how this all connects with you. There's actually a fairly strong connection between the Persian Gulf and you all that you may not realize. That began with the Reformed Church in America, which is centered here more or less in Holland and Western Michigan. The Reformed Church in America had the Arabian mission. These were missionaries that went to Arabia. They went in the late 1800s. It was pretty much founded by Samuel Zwemer, who grew up in Grafskip, went to Hope College, and then went to start the mission in Arabia. Interestingly enough, is one of the reasons he went to Arabia is he thought it was the most challenging field there was to go to, because converting Muslims is not an easy thing to do. And it continues to be that way. So a little bit on that. So the relationship with the RCA in this topic, and many of the missionaries were supported by churches in this area. So some of the names are very familiar. By the way, the Arabian mission had over 350 people, and it still exists. It's fairly small now, but in its totality, there were 350 people. And I added up all the years of service, and I come up with almost 5 millennium. 5,000 years of service to the Gulf area by the Arabian mission. This is adding up everybody's time there. That's quite a big chunk, 5,000 years. Many of the Arabian mission personnel went to Hope College, certainly more than any other college. And again, the names might sound familiar, and many of them were from Holland and from churches in the area. And then there's also the relationship with HASP. A number of them have been members of HASP. Right now, it's the Dorenbosses, Don Leidens, Bob Leidens, myself, that have been associated with the Arabian mission. Let's look a little bit at the geography, what we're talking about here. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. So this is the area we're talking about, and this is the Persian Gulf here. I took this as a very old map where it says Persia. This is now called Iran. You'll see when the missionaries went there, it was Persia, and this was Mesopotamia. Well, that's an old name, but for much of the time of the Arabian mission, it was Mesopotamia. That's now Iraq. And the Arabian mission had 5 stations. They had one in Imara, Iraq, which is actually very close to the Iranian border. Basra is also close to the border. Kuwait, Bahrain, this is the old spelling of Bahrain. It's now AIN and officially. And then Muscat, which is in Oman. An interesting thing you might notice, I haven't put in the borders. That's because they didn't really have borders. And that has been one of the huge problems in the Middle East, is where are the borders? And they're still arguing about that, and they have disputes. As a matter of fact, they changed quite a bit. Here's Qatar, which is spelt the old way with a K, now it's a Q. Q-U-T-A-R. Not too long ago, actually, Saudi just took some of Qatar's land here. And so it's still changing a little bit, but it was tribal. There were Bedouins that just went back and forth. They weren't that concerned about where the borders were. There wasn't a whole lot to care about. You went from oasis to oasis, and what was between, well, there wasn't much there to worry about. So that's an overview of the mission. And as you can see, we're pretty much all around the Gulf. Amara and Basra were taken over we were kicked out by the Iraqis in the late 50s. We still have a mission in Kuwait and in Bahrain and in Muscat. They're all quite small, except for the Bahrain one is quite large. There's a very large hospital there, a church with, I think, over 20 congregations in different languages, and a school. Muscat has, there's no hospital there, the only hospitals in Bahrain. But anyway, three of the missions are actually still operating. One of the goals of the early mission was to go into Saudi Arabia. And we did have a number of missions that went temporarily into Saudi Arabia, but we were never allowed to build a mission there. My relationship in the family started in 1946 when my parents went to Kuwait. This is the mission compound in Kuwait, and they went there for 2 years of language study. One of the things that the missionaries required was that they speak the language fluently, and that took 2 years. Actually takes a lot more than 2 years. I can prove that, but anyway, 2 years was sufficient to be fairly, to understand the natives and get to know the dialects. So they spent their first 2 years in Kuwait learning Arabic. And the reason that they did that is to build the trust. To build a trusting relationship with somebody, you need to speak their language to understand the way they think and so on. And also eat their food and live like they do. And the early missionaries pretty much did that. We had a little bit nicer housing than the others, but I know my parents tried to eat the local food. They spent most of the day speaking Arabic with Arabs. And these were more of the common folk. Nowadays, when people from the States go over to Arabia, and that includes me, by the way, when I go with the State Department, we tend to interact only with the upper class, with the rich, the prominent businessmen, and then of course the diplomats and the local government. And we really miss out. They're the ones that tell us what they want us to know, and we don't get to know the common folk. So the missionaries really did that, and they had the trust of the local people, and we're going to see how that plays out. By the way, my first language was Arabic. All my friends were Arabs, and I was not allowed to speak English or Arabic during meals. That's how I learned English. So if I wanted a piece of chicken, it had to be in English. I couldn't say dajaj in Arabic. Because my parents knew that I would have to speak English someday and be fluent at that. Well, that's Arabia in 1946. Now, something happened in 1931 that really changed the Arab world. And actually, it happened in Bahrain, believe it or not, this little island in the middle of the Gulf. And that's that oil was discovered. And this was only about 15 miles from the mission in Bahrain. And when they first found it, they had no idea how much was there. In fact, the king of Saudi Arabia, Abdulaziz, did not believe there was any oil in his country. Well, it took a long time for the money to start rolling in. And because of the wars, it was starting to be developed just before World War II, but then the war stopped that. So the oil money didn't really come in until the 60s to have much effect on the Arab world. Now, the reason I'm pointing that out is one of the things that brought trust, a great deal of trust, besides the linguistic aspect, to the Arabian mission was that we were there before oil. And the leaders of the Arab world will tell you that. You all came before oil. We came there to give. Once oil came in, everyone that is there to take. They're there for the oil. And the Arabs know this. So the mission has had, quite a good reputation there. A small point that is hard to imagine, but I think it's true, is that when the oil concessions came out, they were given to the United States. They could have probably been given to the British. The British really wanted them. Why were they given to the US? It's because the leaders trusted the American mission. And they knew that these were good people. They weren't there to extract just from them. Unfortunately, our government now is kind of doing that. And I need to point out that the missionaries never felt part of the US government. In fact, we made a point to tell people, no, we're not part of the US government. So that led to the United States getting the oil concessions in Saudi Arabia and in Kuwait. Now that area produces about 60% of the world's oil. And the oil ran the engine of the world economy for many, many years. It still is. I think it's definitely lessening now. And especially when we go to the electrification of transportation, that's going to change things in a big way. And the Arabs are worried about that. I want to show you something interesting. We're going to go back to Kuwait in 1946. This is the mission. This is where my family lived. This is the men's hospital, the women's hospital. This is the church, which was the first building in the country to be made out of cement and reinforced concrete. And you can see we're about the nicest buildings in the whole town. The population of the town was maybe 20 to 40,000 people. So I'm showing this because this is before oil. I've had 2 tours in Kuwait. My last tour, the first one was during the Gulf War, the second Gulf War, and then I was there up to 2012. And I want to show you what Kuwait looks now, what oil has done. That's Kuwait now. Did you notice a difference between the 2 pictures? All right, I can go back and forth if it wasn't clear. These people are rolling in money. If you're a Kuwait citizen, you pay no taxes, all your schooling is free, all your medical is free. The government gives you a free loan for your house. What happened here? I didn't do anything. We need our computer expert. I didn't touch anything.
What's that?
There, this one.
Oh.
Okay. All right. So they're pretty well off there now. You get a free loan for your house for $330,000, and you're guaranteed an annual income of $60,000. If any of you thinking of changing your citizenship to Kuwaiti, it's not allowed. So I'm gonna have to I have to stop that dream right now. So that's Kuwait. Oh, just ignore me. Okay. That's Kuwait in 2019. And this has happened to much of the Arab world. Now, why has this happened? And what is our relation to it? Well, that's my next slide. like I said, oil has run the economy of the world since the 40s. It's played a huge role. It's now time to start ending that role, but we can't deny how important it was at the time. This is US oil consumption. This is barrels per person per year. So you can see each one of us here consumes about 22 barrels, and we're more than double than anyone else. And you look at a place like in Africa and so on, and they're less than a barrel a year. Well, I'm pointing this out because we need oil. We need it for our big cars to heat our houses. We like warm houses. We like big houses. We like to fly a lot. We have to have oil. And that's where the Middle East came in, and that's what's important to us. So this has driven our interest in the Middle East. And that plays into the security of the Middle East, where we're going to get to that soon. The US has 4% of the world population, and we consume 20% of the world's output. And 60% of the world's output comes out through the Gulf, the Persian Arabian Gulf. Therefore, that is a huge strategic importance to us, that we are willing to fight wars for or do whatever we need to do to ensure that that continues. And we keep our oil cheap. I've lived in Europe many, many years. When you go to fill up your car, it hurts. It hurts really bad. In the US, it's a mild pain, I think. Most of us go there and don't, you know, nowadays a fill up is what, 40, 50 bucks? When you go and fill up in Europe, it's like 250 bucks. The wallet definitely feels that. So we've kept our prices low, which makes us keep needing more oil. A lot of this is subsidized in many, many ways that we don't realize. Well, does anyone remember what happened about oil in 1973? I certainly do. I remember being in line, trying to get gas, wondering if I would. What happened is the Arabs finally realized they had nationalized the oil companies, and they finally realized that this was a political tool that they could utilize. They were mad at the United States for some of the political decisions that we had made concerning Israel and Palestine. They didn't have a military to do anything, but they had oil. So they started using oil as a weapon. This was a wake-up call for the United States. It was and we really started to get worried. I mean, our economy could crash without oil. We had to have that oil. So we needed to keep the oil flowing for strategic purposes, to keep our economy vibrant, to keep Americans happy so they can drive their big cars, heat their houses, have their big houses, their big lawns and whatever. That's what we do in the States. Drive a lot, fly a lot. So we had the 1991 Gulf War, and then we had the Fifth Fleet. By the way, I was on the predecessor of the Fifth Fleet. It was called Commander Middle East Force, and I served on that staff for 1 year. That was my Navy tour in Bahrain. Now, when I was there, we had typically 3 to 5 ships, a flagship, and then a few destroyers, and so on. Now they have 2 aircraft carriers, and it's just massive. It's a huge organization. The base that I worked on in Bahrain was this little sleepy place. Now it's this massive, massive organization. Bahrain is the center of the Fifth Fleet in the Arabian Gulf. Then in 2001, we had the Twin Towers. Why did the Twin Towers happen? It happened because we were supporting the royal family, and there was a lot of dissidents within Saudi Arabia. And the dissidents wanted the US out because they felt we were a bad influence on the country, and we were keeping the royal family in power, which many people thought were corrupt and needed to be replaced, but the US was supporting them. So 20 young men decided to do what they could. They took over some airliners, flew it into major buildings in the Pentagon and in New York City, the Twin Towers. And these 20 young men changed the world. It's amazing, the change. You go to the airport, you feel it. You go through all that security and whatnot. A new paradigm of how we function in the world. And we got to understand just how important oil was and what a weapon it could be. And then, of course, the Twin Towers led to the problem in Iraq and then Afghanistan. And I remember clearly, I was at the embassy at that time, and I remember the US government saying telling us in the embassy that this conflict would cost about $80 billion, $60 to $80 billion. And the figures now are, the low figure is $1.5 trillion, and I am seeing figures up to $6 trillion from this. That's what we're paying to have oil from the Middle East. That's why the security of the Persian Gulf, where most of the oil comes from, is a big issue, and we're going to talk about that some more. So that was the 2003 Gulf War, and I put question marks on it because it went from 80 billion to 1.5 trillion, and now I'm hearing figures of 6 trillion. By the way, interestingly, in the embassy, I was in the embassy in Kuwait during the second Gulf War in 2003, went through all of that, and we didn't really know what it was about. Can you believe that? I mean, we would go, why are we doing this? And the military people were asking the same question. Well, if there's any reason besides oil, I'd be interested in hearing about it. It was just to secure our oil. And you know how that has changed. A little bit about how everything has changed in the embassy world. When I first joined the State Department, we would have reading rooms for people to come in. And people could come into the embassy, read. That was for them to get to know the United States, and we could show them around the embassy. Embassies are, have paintings from Americans and sculptures and so on. It's sort of a cultural visit. And you brought people in and showed them around. Those days are gone. The embassies now are like forts. The embassy, the last one I was in Kuwait, we had about 60 US citizens working in the embassy. We had 3 layers of guards. The Kuwaitis had tanks around the area and personnel carriers. Then we had 2 sets of civilian guards. One was like a police. And then the final ring around us was 500 people. So we had over 500 guards to guard 60 people. That's what it's become like to you. That's how bad security is over there. So I've gone over some of the consequences, but it's been the longest US war, as you've probably all heard in the news. I guess it's finally over now, it seems like. I think it caused the Great Recession, which damaged all of our monies, our savings and whatnot. It certainly destabilized Arabia, and it has created huge refugee and humanitarian crises. And that continues to this day. I mean, we're trying to bring a lot of people into the US now. A lot of loss of prestige for our country. When I was a young person growing up in the Middle East, America was the place. It was the model that everybody wanted to emulate. We were very highly thought of. People respected us and the country. That has really degraded. It's been very hard for me to see that because I've been so intimately involved with that and witnessed that loss. And even now, right now, we're supporting the Saudis in this brutal war in Yemen, which is in the news. A lot of people are dying, and it just doesn't look good for us. Now, what's been the human cost of these wars? You know, the Iran-Iraq war, and that was a lot to do with they wanted the oil, the land with the oil, so they were fighting each other, and we were in some ways causing some of that. Over 500,000 people died in that. You know, we get pretty uptight coming out of Afghanistan, where we've maybe lost 2,000, and that's terrible. That is really bad, but 500,000? And then the first Gulf War was, they don't even know how many died. I mean, a lot of times we covered trenches with people in them, people alive, and just covered them with sand as the tanks rolled in. But somewhere between 8,000 and 50,000 Iraqis, and the US lost 2,500. Then the Iraq War from 2003 to 11 that we were involved in against Saddam Hussein, somewhere just under 300,000. Now, most of those are Iraqis, but we lost some people too. And now in Afghanistan, something like 250,000. All of this is for oil, people. You know, we're talking about a lot of people here that have died because of that. What is it that the Gulf states want? Well, a lot of these are monarchies. The number one issue they have is to stay in power. You know, let's put our priorities up on a board. Number one, we got to stay in power, guys, whatever that takes. Then they're worried about income, because the way you keep the society happy is you give them lots of money. You give them houses, you give them free this and free that, and you show that you're the good guy because you're giving them so much, and that keeps them kind of quiet. The other thing is the Gulf states are really worried about Iran. The difference here is mainly religious. It's two factions of Islam. The Arabs are Sunni, and the Iranians are Shia. And there's a huge difference there. And, you know, we can say, you know, why is that a big deal? Well, let's look at ourselves in Europe. We've had some pretty bad wars over religion too. So that's a huge issue for them. What are the differences between the Arabs and the Persians? I've already been over the religion one. A lot of it is how the power came down from Muhammad. Is the next leader from Muhammad's family, or is it the next leader elected? This is a huge issue to them, and they differ on that. The Iranians speak an Indo-European language, Farsi, and the Arabs speak a Semitic language, which is Arabic. And those are very different. So they don't understand each other very well because of that. The Arabs are mostly a nomadic society, Bedouins that they wander from place to place, don't really own any specific land, where the Persians are quite sedentary. The culture is very different. You can just tell the difference. The way they dress, their food is different. Of course, their speech is different. The way they comport themselves is different. A lot of the attitudes that they have are so different. In the Arab world, I can tell whether somebody's immediately, whether they're an Arab or an Iranian. They look different too. The genetic pool is different from which they come from. The populations is a huge, huge difference. The population of Iran is around 80 million. And in Iraq is about half of that at 40 million. A lot of the other states are quite small. But population is a big problem there because it's exploding. When we lived in Saudi Arabia, the population was around 12 million or so, which is 3 times what the country can actually support. The land of Saudi Arabia can support about 4 million. So by that time, when we were there, it was about 12 million. The only way they do that is they bring everything in. They really don't have any natural resources except oil. The other one is sun. But believe it or not, that is a natural resource, because they maybe do solar energy or something and export that. But there's no water there in Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia, by the way, now is getting close to 30 million. So you have 30 million in a country that really can only support 4 million. What happens when the money stops rolling in? So future issues, this is going to happen. It's happening now. The loss of revenue, the loss of oil dollars. And as the US has less dependence on the Middle East, because we're actually producing a fair amount of oil now, and we're trying to even go off of that with electric cars and solar power in houses and whatnot. So this is going to be a huge issue for them. They've gotten used to this and gotten used, as I've said, to giving a lot of money to their population to keep them quiet. Those days are going to go. The huge populations I talked about are up there, and they're growing fast. And who are they growing with? They're young people. And these young people don't have jobs, and they don't think about the world the way the older people do. They want some help. And you know, what happens when a young person's not in school and not going to work? I think, you know, you with kids like myself, you know what happens in a situation like that. It can get pretty nasty. And it's just change is happening big time. So they have to accommodate that. Now, we're going to move into the video next. And before we go into that, I'd like to have you think about a few things. Watch for some catchphrases in the video that long-held assumptions are changing. The paradigm there is changing. The days of oil and having more money than you know what to do with, which probably actually is a problem in some of the Arab countries, or has been, that's going away. And what's the threat to the US in the Middle East? Do we really care that much anymore? Think about that. And these wars are going on forever. A massive paradigm shift. The world is changing. Right now, they're in Glasgow, the G20 or whatever. What are they talking about? They're talking about going off of fossil fuel. We're talking about ending the money supply for these guys. Now, we're not going to go off of fossil fuel completely. We need it for quite a few things. But the need for it is going to go way down. And the Arab world, where that is where their economy is based on, they've got some problems ahead of them. I already told you that even we in the embassy weren't sure what the Iran-Iraq war was. And even now, you read about it, and some of the leaders go, why did we do that? Well, the only thing I can come up with is oil. So what is behind the current motive of US policy in the Middle East? So these are things that I would ask you to think about as you see the video, and we'll do the video next.
For American policymakers, the significance of the Persian Gulf region has long been an article of faith.
America and the world must defend and preserve the
vital interests that are at stake for America in the Persian Gulf
is a fundamental tenet of American foreign policy.
But as oil prices fall and fatigue mounts from 2 decades of war, some experts are reevaluating long-held assumptions about the Middle East. Great Decisions examines the future of American engagement in the Persian Gulf and asks what the new decade will bring to a region on the cusp of change. Persian Gulf security, next on Great Decisions.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association. in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Herford Foundation, PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
A new day is dawning in the Persian Gulf. A younger generation of leaders is taking the reins of power.
We've already seen some transitions. In Qatar, for example, the current emir is in his 30s, I think probably more like 40 now. There are some other parts of the Gulf. Oman, for example, Sultan Qaboos passed away in late 2019. The new Sultan has taken over.
Mohammed bin Salman is a young leader. He just turned 35. He's the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. And Mohammed bin Zayed, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi. He's also the de facto ruler of the United Arab Emirates. Mohammed bin Zayed has been around for a while.
Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed are two of the most powerful players in the Gulf region. They're relatively young compared to historically what the leaders were.
In recent years, the Persian Gulf monarchies have become more assertive in their foreign policies.
And now we've seen the political ambitions that has caused the UAE to get itself involved in all kinds of wars and military interventions in Syria, to Libya, to Yemen, all of them with disastrous effects.
Mohammed bin Salman also went on military adventures, namely in Yemen. This is definitely a new approach to diplomacy by these two countries. More assertive, more militaristic, more bullish, but it doesn't always pay off, and it has come with a great toll for the people on the ground.
They're destroying one of the most important, if you like, regional cooperation bodies, which is the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. As much as we want to believe them and to believe their visions, the reality on the ground does not support that.
The newfound boldness of the Persian Gulf monarchies comes at a time when successive U.S. presidents have talked about scaling back American military commitments in the region.
Today, I can report that, as promised, the rest of our troops in Iraq will come home by the end of the year. Tens of thousands of them will pack up their gear and board convoys for the journey home.
As a candidate for president, I loudly pledged a new approach. Great nations do not fight endless wars.
It's long past time we end the forever wars, which have cost us untold blood and treasure.
The US has long had a goal of reducing its force presence in the Gulf to a minimum that is compatible with a projection of US interests. But as long as the US continues to see a threat to its own regional interests from Iran and potentially from adversaries like Russia and China, there will be a case for maintaining US basing and a minimal level of US forces in the Gulf.
Now, after decades of protracted engagement, experts and policymakers are wondering whether it is time for the United States to reconsider its role in the Persian Gulf.
Today, the United States spends about 20 times as much money on military programming as we do on all other forms of foreign assistance. That doesn't make sense, and we've got to start thinking about our ability to project influence in the Middle East through something other than a simple military prism.
I think there is a need for a paradigm shift in the way that the United States has been managing its relationship with the region and its involvement in the region. It has to live up to those principles that built the United States the power that it is.
I see Saudi Arabia and Iran as equally responsible for the abyss that the region finds itself in. They have both played a very destructive role over the last 40 years. It is worth taking that into consideration when devising American policy for the region.
I think it's very important to recognize that a military disengagement from the Middle East and an end to our endless wars and our endless military presence in no way, shape, or form signals an end of actual engagement. It is long overdue for the United States to reassess its policy towards the Middle East in general, but the Persian Gulf in particular.
Thanks to the joint efforts of British, American, and Arab workers, many years of unceasing labor have begun to reap a rich reward. Now, as never before, the drive for new oil reserves in the Middle East is of vital importance to the great powers.
In February 1945, Franklin Roosevelt made a detour on his way home from the Yalta Conference. As World War II drew to a close, Roosevelt was already focused on what he believed would be one of the key issues of the post-war era: the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia.
The meeting between Roosevelt and Ibn Saud was extremely important because, above all, it was symbolic. Tying the United States to Saudi Arabia, the U.S. became the protector that can actually protect the oil fields.
When you look back at the historical records and the notes taken at the meeting, they, as far as we can tell, spoke about oil very little. And in fact, the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia did not become nearly as robust as it is today until the late 1960s, even early 1970s.
In response to U.S. support for Israel in the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, Arab countries instituted an oil embargo, briefly disrupting the free flow of oil from the region.
The 1973 oil crisis changed, I think, the view of the US in terms of the Gulf parties becoming more assertive. People suddenly became aware that the Middle East and the Gulf itself were no longer countries that could be dictated to in terms of what to do.
Failure to end the embargo in a reasonable time would be highly inappropriate and would raise serious questions of confidence in our mind with respect to the Arab nations with whom we have dealt on this issue.
The 1973 oil embargo didn't last for too long, and oil continued to flow, albeit in smaller quantities. But it drew attention to the power of Saudi Arabia, that it could actually use oil as a weapon.
Before the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq in 2003, many critics accused the government of waging a war for oil. But the reality of a war for oil, experts say, is considerably more complicated.
In the case of the 2003 Iraq War, we're still scratching our heads trying to figure out what this war was really about. Americans suspected that oil was the motivation, but we actually don't have any evidence of that. So there are definitely limits in the understanding of Americans for why the United States government uses military force to defend oil and when it's likely to do it.
Oil is so essential still, unfortunately, to the international economy, and we are part of that international economy. Even if we don't need that particular oil, it's going to affect other economies and therefore affect our economy.
After a period of high prices, the price of oil has fallen dramatically in recent years.
Oil price is a global phenomenon associated with supply and demand. There's a lot more suppliers on the market, so naturally speaking, the prices will be lower.
On the supply side, you had all of a sudden in mid-2014, U.S. shale oil and gas production, particularly in the Permian Basin in Midland, Texas, skyrocketing. That glut in supply also contributed to a downturn in price.
Although we have growing demand from China and India, we also have more energy efficiency taking hold, particularly in Europe and also in the US. The result has been lower oil prices. The question is whether we return to the past 2 decades period of elevated prices at any point in time, or whether we go back to sort of pre-2000 range of prices.
Economic planners in the Persian Gulf have long recognized the need to prepare for the day when oil is no longer a valuable commodity. But putting their plans into action has been easier said than done.
We continue our efforts to diversify our income source by enlarging the circle of those investing in our assets.
It's the addiction to oil or hydrocarbons. Simply put, when you're extracting and getting a lot of money in a very simple manner, it's kind of hard to be disciplined.
We are talking about small countries here with small population. For them to be able to diversify, they need to work together. They need to coordinate. They need to integrate their economies. They need to create a much larger market. And as we have been seeing, this is not happening.
There's just been this assumption that the leaders within these countries would take care of their people, and that relationship has manifested as a strong civil service body generating employment across the board, very generous packages. The revenues associated with fossil fuels have been able to power that.
There's quite a lot of disparity between the various Gulf states. The UAE is definitely the standout, let's say, leader in the region. But Saudi Arabia's critical mass, the sheer size of their economy and their population, also gives them a decisive advantage.
Experts acknowledge that a decline in oil revenues will force the Persian Gulf monarchies to reevaluate their spending priorities.
Questions may be raised as to why there's so much money being spent abroad when people within Saudi Arabia are feeling the backlash of increased taxes and fees, of job cuts, of struggling to make ends meet. And so we may well see increased social pressure that could then build into political pressure on Saudi Arabia and on some of the other Gulf states as well.
I think that expat workers are going to be the most affected, and that's because they are considered, to be an elastic, transient labor force. And basically what will happen is you'll see an exodus of expatriates leaving the Gulf states.
As Persian Gulf oil becomes less critical to the global economy, American policymakers will have to grapple with new questions about the motivations behind U.S. policy in the region.
The U.S. has strategic interests in the Gulf. There are a lot of U.S. universities in the Gulf. There are large communities of U.S. citizens working in the private sectors of Gulf economies. Gulf investment is important coming into the U.S., so it's much more than just a simple, we provide security and you provide oil.
It's not only about the oil, it's the purchasing of defense equipment and weapons are a large part of U.S. Gulf ties. Also, the relationship, the business relations, and there are a lot of benefits to being in the region.
In the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, then President Jimmy Carter made a bold statement of American interests in the Persian Gulf.
President Carter announced in his 1980 State of the Union address that the United States valued the Persian Gulf as a vital national security interest.
An attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interest of the United States of America, and such an assault will be repelled by any means necessary, including military force.
During the 1980s, the U.S. tried to combat Iran by increasing its presence in the Persian Gulf.
Iran and the Ayatollah now threaten stability in the region. So we ended up having a greater commitment to the security of the region with the formation of at first the Rapid Deployment Joint Task Force under the Carter administration, and then under the Reagan administration, the creation of the U.S. Central Command.
Saudi Arabia is still there after 1979, but Iran is gone, and it's replaced by an anti-American, potentially extreme regime. So the United States turns to Iraq, of all people. We armed Saddam Hussein, and the idea was that by arming Saddam, he could at least contain Iran.
In the early morning hours of August 2nd, a powerful Iraqi army invaded its trusting and much weaker neighbor, Kuwait, and moved south to threaten Saudi Arabia.
Following the invasion of Kuwait in 1990, the U.S., now the world's lone superpower, guaranteed the security of its allies in the Persian Gulf.
I became ambassador to Saudi Arabia in 1989. The war began in 1990. General Schwarzkopf had a plan for the deployment of some 220,000 troops. We worked out terms for their stationing in Saudi Arabia by making them part of my embassy. Up to that point, the United States had only a minimal military presence in the Persian Gulf.
The Gulf War was the first real commitment of a large number of troops in the region, and we kept a fairly large presence there, probably in the neighborhood on an average day of 28 to 30,000 U.S. troops.
Today, the U.S. maintains permanent military bases throughout the Persian Gulf region.
The main support base for the continuing U.S. presence in Iraq and Afghanistan is a Guthrie Air Base at Udeid. There are troops in Kuwait as backup. There's a very active naval presence in the United Arab Emirates, and the Fifth Fleet, reestablished after the war, is based in Bahrain. The numbers vary, but I think it's probably about 50,000.
Getting the place where we can stage and have American troops know that they will be safe and secure and able to do the job that they have set out to do and accomplish their mission is a very delicate piece of diplomacy, negotiations, and building strong relationships.
They say more war, we say no more.
Increasingly, observers wonder how much the U.S. military presence in the Persian Gulf region actually helps to keep Americans safe.
There are times that the United States has to use troop presence in order to advance our interests. But what we know in and around the Middle East is that generally U.S. troops are a very bad way to try to solve what are at their foundation political problems.
I do think a U.S. military presence, and as one as sizable as necessary, is in our interest because of the capability they provide of having assets forwardly deployed to give us a capability that otherwise might have to come over much longer distances.
I've served in 4 combat deployments in this zone over a 20-year period. I cannot stress enough, having combat troops on the ground in the Middle East does not provide stability, and it doesn't give us any strategic capabilities that we don't already have from our overwhelming military capability with global power projection capabilities.
Many experts say that an American military retreat from the Persian Gulf would create an opportunity for other powers to assert their influence in the region.
Many people believe that we opened the door to Russia having a foothold in the Middle East that it hadn't had for many years. We certainly have seen China play in the region as well. That is a growing concern.
If China and Russia want to get involved in the Persian Gulf, have at it, right? That would not necessarily be bad for American interests. The Persian Gulf, as we've noticed, is a place where countries can get into a lot of trouble.
It is true that when the US retreats, it creates a vacuum that others can fill. Now, does that mean that the US needs to have troops everywhere? No, but it can be more involved without signaling that it is not interested.
I don't know that it's the role of the United States to rid the Middle East of Russian influence or rid the Middle East of Chinese influence. We have to understand as a country that the military and our troop presence is not the only way for us to have influence in that region. China has an enormous amount of influence in the Middle East, and they don't have a single troop there.
Recently, Arab monarchies of the Persian Gulf have turned to a partner that would once have been inconceivable: Israel.
In the past few years, we've actually seen a real strategic convergence of interest of the oil-producing Arab states in the Gulf, the U.S. and Israel, about how to deal with Iran, which is really quite striking.
This is not only a peace between leaders, it's a peace between peoples. Israelis, Emiratis, and Bahrainis are already embracing one another.
The UAE and Israel have been working closely together for at least a decade, possibly longer. So the UAE-Israel deal just normalizes, makes more formal, more open, a relationship which has been ongoing for more than 10 years.
These type of alliances come and go. 45 years ago, they were the opposite. The Iranians were actually tactically behind the scenes allied with the Israelis against the Arabs. And if the United States promotes that type of a game, the Middle East will always be unstable.
In the past few years, a growing chorus of activists has called for the U.S. to stop selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, which has deployed American-made arms against civilians in neighboring Yemen.
When I was in Moscow, I met with President Putin and others, and he said to me, look, if you don't want to sell arms to Saudi Arabia, we'd be happy to sell arms to them. So that's a pretty cold-eyed view of dealings in the contemporary age, but it's one reason why a close U.S. relationship with the kingdom remains very important.
I don't think U.S. Diplomacy, international relationships should be determined by merchants of death in the United States or anywhere else. The Russians are, of course, opportunists. The Chinese, too, will sell weapons, as will virtually everyone. But I don't think that should drive commitments that could result in the death of Americans.
At a time when the geopolitics of the Persian Gulf are in a state of flux, some pundits hope the U.S. can play a productive diplomatic role in the troubled region.
I think that diplomacy is absolutely critical. It's the world's responsibility to try to bring about peace and security, but the United States has an interest in making sure we're at that table. So whatever resolutions come remain in our national security interest and not just in everybody else's.
Having been involved in several of these mediations, I know that it becomes difficult because you are viewed as an outsider. And in some cases, you may be viewed as more pro one side or the other, even though when we take on a mediation role, we try to stress that in that role, we are not picking favorites, we are not taking positions.
The United States cannot play a useful diplomatic role in the region anymore because we have taken sides. Our only instrument of power is military, and we're not clearly prepared to use it, nor is it pointed in any clear direction.
The United States should actually, in my view, take on a much bigger diplomatic role in the region, but not one in which it has to lead everything, but rather be in support of measures to be able to bring about greater stability.
Despite growing calls to draw down the American military presence, it remains to be seen whether the U.S. will be able to disengage from the region which, for decades, has been central to its foreign policy.
So I think it was a mistake, for example, for the Obama administration to talk about a pivot away from the Middle East toward East Asia. I don't see any reason to think in the foreseeable future, 20 years, let's say, that the Middle East is going to become less important in American calculations.
The great pivot to Asia that President Obama wanted to see unfold during his time in the White House did not quite unfold as planned. The Middle East has a way of constantly dragging America back in.
For decades, the U.S. has been the dominant power in the Persian Gulf. And in that time, the region has undergone a profound transformation. Now, as a new generation begins to make its mark, Americans must think carefully about what role their country should play in the decades to come.
Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on global affairs. Discussion groups meet online via Zoom and Google Meets, in person at community centers, libraries, places of worship, and homes across the country to discuss global issues with their community. Participants read the 8-topic briefing book.
Well, I think that should have generated some thoughts I'm interested in what the takeaway is. If you all have a clear answer as to what's happening in the Middle East, I'd be interested in hearing it, frankly. You saw a lot of different opinions there. You know, why are we here? What did we accomplish? I think one of the interesting things that I can't help but think about is having a soldier on the ground in the Middle East and Afghanistan and so on is $2 million a year. That's what we pay. So think about that. When you have 30, 40,000 people there, multiplying that by 2 million, and that doesn't include the equipment. A tank is 60 million. Whereas perhaps another approach that we could do is take a missionary, or it doesn't have to be a missionary, but the equivalent. Somebody go out as a teacher or a doctor and interact with the local folks. That's about 100,000 a year. So for each soldier that you have there that sits, you know, in a military camp and carrying a gun, you could have 20 people out teaching them, helping them be healthy or whatever. I certainly think in the long run, that's a better way to go. And so there's been a lot of questions about the effectiveness of the military that we have had there. I hope this has given you an awareness of the situation. One thing you can think about, are we responsible for protecting the Middle East anymore? Why? We don't really need what they have, and maybe by being there, we're creating more problems. There's different arguments on that. Does the Middle East affect us anymore? So what do we do about it? Well, I'd like to open it up to questions, comments, and
I think we're going to wait for Kim or Susan to look at the chat questions.
Okay.
Now, when she gets done pulling up chat questions, we'll pass the mic around. And if you'd be so kind, this is not to just start talking without the mic. That way we can all hear you. So Kim and Susan, if you're there.
I don't have anything in the chat yet, so go ahead, Larry, if there's questions in the classroom.
Okay, back here.
Well, as English speakers, we don't recognize the contextual way. For example, when they're stationed in Turkey, they would say, how about just how people are saying things makes a difference. So when you repeat questions that the audience asks, you repeat their question and say it in Arabic too.
Oh, sure. Do we have any Arabic speakers here? Oh, the question was that when I give an answer, can I give it both in English and Arabic? Well, I guess I could, but I'm not sure how many people would understand. I think we'll stick to English for this. But that is an intriguing thought. By the way, interesting, that brings an interesting comment. You know, to really understand the people, you got to know their language. And I personally believe that what language you speak actually wires your brain differently. So when I go from Arabic to English, the way my brain is connected is different. And I'm not saying one's better than the other. They're just different. And so these people really think differently. And when we don't know their language and don't talk to them in their language, we're always going to have a miscommunication of some sort. An interesting thought is I was probably employed by the State Department, accepted as an officer in the State Department, to a good degree because of my linguistic capabilities. Growing up there and speaking the language native is very, very rare. In fact, when I left the State Department, the number of State Department people that could get up in front of a crowd, take questions in Arabic, give the presentation in Arabic, covering a fair number of issues was 2 people. I wasn't one of them. I don't consider myself that good. You got to be really good to take an economic question and then an agriculture question to some degree. in another language. I'm pretty good, but I'm not that good. Well, when you have two people in our government that can interact that way with another culture, is it any surprise that we don't understand each other very well? Linguistic ability, being multilingual, is so important to understanding other cultures.
Paul, I have a question in the chat now. It's what portion of our American oil supply is now coming directly from the Middle East, and what portion is now from North America?
That's a good question. I don't have the exact amounts, but I know the amount coming from the Middle East is very small. Right now, we basically don't need the Middle East oil. And that's a huge change because the US now is producing so much with fracking and new techniques of extracting oil. We're pretty much getting all that we need. The Middle East oil is now going to Asia and to Europe. And it's actually in our interest to keep the economic engine of the world going as it is. So it isn't in our interest to keep that going to them. You know, we don't want China to have huge economic problems. That's going to affect us. Everything in our house is made in China these days. We need that. We're very interdependent on the Chinese, the other Asians, and Europe. So to answer the question, I would say, as far as I know, it's an extremely small amount of oil that we need from the Middle East anymore, and I'm not sure we need any. There's all different kinds of oils, different grades that are used for plastics or fuel or paints or lubricants or whatever. So the Middle East oil is very fine oil, so maybe we do use that for some of those specialty oils. But again, to answer the question, I think the US could probably continue on just fine without any Middle East oil now. This has not been the case in the past. This is now, but we need it to keep the world economy going, which is very much in our own interests.
Thanks. The next one is, what role has education exchange played in relations with the area given the numbers that have studied in the US? How about the future?
Yeah, I think the education exchanges is just huge. Educating the people in the Middle East has had such benefits, and especially when it's done in English. That does help us. I think we would rather have them, excuse me, speaking English than say Chinese or something. We are at such a linguistic advantage by the world wanting to speak English. Now, I know I've been saying we need to speak Arabic, and we do, but the fact is that we have taught them, principles of democracy, some great thinking, medicine, and so on. And I think when it comes to academia, the world academic language is English. And so that's been a great benefit. They have sent many, many students to the US to study. There's actually quite a few universities and so on now in the Arab world. Just an interesting point on that. When I grew up in the Arab world, I was sent to school in India because there was no English-speaking schools in all of the Gulf. Right now in Kuwait, there are 46 schools conducted solely in English. So they are trying to, they want to learn English, they want to learn Western ways. By the way, another plug for the Arabian Mission. It was the Arabian Mission that first taught them English. Many of the rulers and so on learned their English from the Arabian Mission and then started interacting with the rest of the world and joining the world community. But I think what we could do is send teachers from the US to be teachers in their schools and to teach them English and other subjects. And you often hear about here in Holland and in the US about teachers that are having trouble finding a job. Hey, why don't we pay those people to go over and have some real fun and some real intercultural experiences in Arabia and India and wherever? And the price tag. I mean, $2 million for a soldier, what's a teacher going to cost over there? We could have a whole bunch of teachers rather than some person carrying a gun around. Next.
Since I went to Ukraine and it was a program called Hope Camp Ukraine that was, I think, proposed and supported by the Ukrainian government to some degree, is there something like that, that we could deal with in the Persian Gulf that those of us maybe would like to teach there to find a way, to get there inexpensively? I mean, you mentioned, the program reform and the other things from the Persian Gulf that we could find into.
The question is, are there programs perhaps supported by the governments in Arabia or foreign countries that could help bring teachers to those countries? Well, let me just first say, I wish there was a lot more. There are some. Certainly, I know at the universities in Kuwait, the two that I visited fairly regularly when I was there, they really want US teachers to come there. The English and American academics are considered really at the top end, and I think we are in most fields. And so the students want to learn English. They don't want to learn some other language from Europe or Asia. Learning English and knowing English and being fluent in it is the one that's going to give them the most coverage in the world. I will say that salaries are not that high, unfortunately. What I would like to see is that our government would kick in some money for that. Again, take some of the money that's being spent on the military and put it towards something like that. And that's long-term gain. This is, the effects of a program like that can take, 5 years, 10 years, or whatever. But I think it's a great experience for people to do something like that. And I would like to see that kind of model supported. That's why I'm telling you all about it. I think that needs to grow, and the benefits from it would be enormous. One of the things that's kind of like that is the Peace Corps. But, vastly increase the Peace Corps. Certainly, I've known many of the teachers that have taught in the universities and high schools in the Middle East. There's a lot of positions there. And I know they come to the US, they have fairs where they look for people to go over there. Good question. I like that train of thought, by the way.
A couple more have come into the chat. One is, if the retention of power is primary to Arabic leaders, how could we assist a transition from giveaways coming from oil guaranteed by military presence to investment in people and infrastructure?
Wow, that's a tough one. How do you convince these rulers that there's another way to go? How do you convince our own government that there's another way to go than the military? And I'm not anti-military. There are points where it's needed. But I'm talking about the same issue for us, is to help us see that there are other ways than the military. We keep talking about it with these foreign leaders and suggest with it. I think one of the ways that you do is you start a program and show that it's successful. One of the issues, unfortunately, with the military is there's a lot of bucks. So a lot of people and a lot of companies are making big bucks off of this, and they don't want that to stop, so they can push it. But basically what you're saying, I'd like to see that happen, is that somehow we can convince these foreign leaders that there's a better way to go than the military. Yes.
Next two questions are fairly similar. They're related to travel. With the world slowly reopening to tourism, are there areas in the region that you would recommend traveling to, and which ones should be avoided?
Well, there's some great places to visit in the Middle East. Oman is just unbelievably beautiful. And so that's pretty safe. Right now, Israel and Egypt and so on, which have a lot of history, and Syria, I would be hesitant to visit some of those, especially right now with COVID. I think you would want to wait till COVID finishes, is over with, and who knows when that'll be. But having grown up in India and the Arab world, boy, there's some fantastic places to visit just to get to know the people and how they think differently and whatnot. But in the Arab world, just to reiterate, I would say the safest places are Oman and the Emirates. And they do have large tourist industries there. Some of the countries like Saudi Arabia, they don't even want tourists. So that's out of the question. Right.
The nomadic style of living was very prominent in the Middle East for a long time. Is that still there a lot? And is it still fractured that they're not united towards it?
Yeah, the question is whether the nomadic lifestyle is still active in the Middle East, and is there friction between the different small nomadic communities? Am I stating that correctly? Okay, first of all, the nomadic lifestyle has pretty much ended because now there's borders, and the government has wanted to put the people into cities. So the Bedouins going from, one oasis to another, that lifestyle is pretty much gone. It was pretty brutal lifestyle. If somebody was at the oasis and they weren't of your tribe, you had to do whatever you could do to get them out of there, and it wasn't pretty because you wanted the oasis. So there was a lot of banditry and skirmishes and so on. And life was really harsh out on, for the Bedouin. These people still do have tremendous differences. They can tell what tribe they're from. You can tell from the last name. You can tell from their accent. They have different beliefs. They don't get along all that well with each other. I think we can see that in the US too. People don't get along with each other real well in a lot of places. So it's an issue, and the government's trying to keep them all together, trying to build a national identity, which is kind of interesting. This is one of the things that happened in Kuwait. Saddam Hussein wanted to destroy the national identity of Kuwait. And so he took the National Museum and took everything out of it, and it's never come back. And in Kuwait, the National Museum is still an empty shell because Kuwait wants you to know that Iraq destroyed it, and they're still trying to get those items back. So yeah, lots of different identities there that people are trying to get along with each other.
Is the difference in religious beliefs a factor in all this relationship between the West and
the question is the difference in religious beliefs a factor in how the Western world and Arabia get along? Absolutely. They have the internal issue with themselves. They're all Muslims, yet there's three major brands of Muslims: the Shia, the Sunni, and then the ones in Oman has a different brand also. And they see life differently, and they don't get along, as I said, too well with each other. But certainly with the Western world, they have a huge issue. Now, actually, Jesus is in the Quran and plays a major role in the Quran. They don't believe in the crucifixion, but they believe that Jesus did go up to heaven. And he's a very prominent and respected prophet in the Quran. But they look at Western morals, they see our movies, they see our media, and they go, well, you guys aren't following those principles. And so there's a disgust with how Christianity is practiced. Like Gandhi and some of the other ones, they've said, I like your Jesus, I just don't like your Christians.
So it is a factor
It is, yeah, yeah. It is a big factor. Yeah.
Wonderful presentation, just as a
thank you.
There, but, we were talking earlier, the question was posited that what was the reason for the Iraq War? Why did we do that? And as I recall, they had invaded Kuwait. And didn't we have a national commitment to protect countries in that area from that kind of thing happening? That seemed to me that was the reason. And then once we went in and destroyed everything and there was a void left, then it got completely out of hand.
Yeah, the question is the reason for the war. What was the reason for the war? And wasn't it because they attacked Kuwait? And that's true, they did attack Kuwait. But why did they attack Kuwait? And why were we involved? It's because we needed the oil. You know, there's little skirmishes all over the world all the time, in Africa and Asia and so on. And we kind of basically leave them alone. But this one, because we had such national interests in Kuwait, that we got involved. So it was the oil. And Saddam attacked Kuwait because he needed the money. They all want the money. Saddam was having this long, protracted war with Iran with 500,000 people dead and his people angry and so on. He needed to show something for all those deaths and all that money spent. And what he was going to show was he was going to get some money out of Kuwait. And so he invaded.
Should we have not gotten involved?
Well, yeah, the question is, should we not have gotten involved? Well, what I'm saying is we would have never been involved to begin with if it wasn't for oil. And because of our addiction to oil, and we have to have it, we got involved. But yeah, that's a good question. And how much should we have gotten involved? You know, we've spent, as a result of all this, $1.5 trillion. Well, we could have put that money somewhere else maybe to get oil. What did we owe the Kuwaitis for what they've given us? And what do we owe the Saudis for what they've given us? Is it blind loyalty? You guys do whatever you want. You know, you be absolute monarchs and you do this and do that, and by golly, we're going to support you. Is that right? It's a hard balance. How much do we support them? What should we have done? We could have stopped at the border, maybe. Maybe we should have been there to begin with, that our intelligence agencies would have said, hey, these guys are coming across. You know, we usually can predict that kind of thing. If they're that good friends, maybe we should have had a small presence there so that they never attack. I don't have a real good absolute answer here. A lot of these things don't have absolute answers, but that is an excellent question. But again, I will go back that if we didn't have this addiction to oil, we wouldn't be having any of this. It's all about oil.
We have time for one more question, and then see who wants to make it.
Going back to historically, like World War I, perhaps, but World War II, there was a breakdown of the Ottoman Empire, and it was distributed by Europe.
Yeah, right.
And that is a key to a lot of what's going on, is the breakdown of a failing empire.
Yeah, the question is that the part of the problem there is due to the breakdown of the Ottoman Empire and the way that the national lines were drawn there. And they can't agree on this. And by the way, they still can't agree on it. The Ottoman Empire did crumble in World War I, but you know, they were really colonizing these countries. These were all countries that existed. They didn't like the Ottomans, by the way. The Iraqis despised the Ottomans, and so did the Kuwaitis. They certainly didn't want to be ruled by the Ottomans. So in a sense, they got their independence. And the British were basically in control of the whole area, and they drew the national boundary lines. It wasn't an easy task. I'm not blaming the British because there were no lines. And the population was very low at that time, and they didn't know where to put the line. So they had to draw a line somewhere. And these lines are actually changing. And there's, for instance, with Kuwait, there's 2 zones of Kuwait that belong to both Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. They still can't resolve these chunks of land, who they belong to. And it goes back to World War I and the British and so on. Yeah, it's caused lots of problems. You know, where's the border of Israel? Where should it be? Where's the border of Qatar? And that has changed just in the last decade or so when the Saudis just moved in and moved the border. This has been a huge issue, and it hasn't been a pretty problem. There's no real good answer to that. A lot of that land, nobody really cared about that much until they found this black gold under it. Then everybody wanted it. You know, Kuwait is really, there's not much there. I've had 2 tours there, and it's just desert, but it also has the 2nd largest oil field in the world. Well, that's a lot of money there. That's what made the difference. In fact, these areas that I'm talking about that are jointly owned, the reason they can't resolve it is they don't really know how much oil is under there, and they don't want to give it up.
Our time is up, folks, and all I can really say is that I think Paul has given us a lot to think about and consider. So thank you very much, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for being with us this morning. Have a great afternoon.